For 30 years, Johnny Carson was America's most trusted late-night host, welcoming Hollywood's biggest stars into living rooms across the nation with his warm smile and gracious charm. Behind that professional demeanor, however, Carson kept a mental list of guests he privately considered truly awful human beings. According to a former producer who worked alongside him for over a decade, Carson maintained his composure on camera, but would occasionally lean over to Ed McMahon during commercial breaks and whisper that certain guests should never be near a camera or a child. In his later years, Carson became more candid with close friends about the celebrities he'd secretly despised throughout his career, sharing stories that painted a disturbing picture of beloved icons who were nothing like their public personas. These weren't just difficult or demanding personalities. Carson described them as genuinely dark individuals whose cruelty and arrogance left a permanent mark on everyone who encountered them backstage at Studio One in Burbank. Frank Sinatra. Whenever Frank Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show, viewers saw effortless chemistry between two entertainment legends. The chairman of the board would joke, tell stories, occasionally break into song, while Carson smiled and played the gracious host. To audiences watching at home, they seemed like old friends, sharing easy camaraderie over drinks and cigarettes. But according to those who worked closest with Carson, the reality off-camera was far less friendly. Carson deeply disliked Sinatra, not for his immense talent, which he fully respected, but for the way Old Blue Eyes treated people when the spotlight wasn't shining on him. If he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer, Carson once confided to a friend, as several biographies later confirmed. And sometimes, I think he was both. That private assessment revealed everything about how Carson truly viewed one of the 20th century's most celebrated entertainers. Sinatra's visits to the show were infamous among the crew for the tension they created from the moment he arrived. Staff members recalled that he never came alone, always surrounded by an entourage of 6 to 8 men who looked nothing like typical Hollywood handlers. They weren't showbiz guys, one stagehand remembered years later, more like the kind of men you'd avoid in a dark alley. These men would fan out around the studio, watching the staff with cold expressions, creating an atmosphere that one cameraman described as feeling like being under surveillance in your own workplace. The presence of these intimidating figures transformed the normally relaxed Studio One into something closer to a guarded compound. Production assistants learned quickly to stay out of their way, and even veteran crew members felt uneasy whenever Sinatra was scheduled to tape. Carson himself reportedly found the whole display distasteful, viewing it as an unnecessary show of force designed to remind everyone exactly who wielded the real power in the room. What disturbed Carson most profoundly was witnessing how Sinatra treated anyone he considered beneath his station. During one taping in the early 1970s, a floor manager made the routine mistake of giving Sinatra the standard 3-minute warning before his segment was scheduled to begin. According to multiple witnesses who were present that night, Sinatra's reaction was swift and terrifying. He grabbed the man by his tie, yanked him close until their faces were inches apart, and growled, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The floor manager, a Korean War veteran in his 50s who had worked in television for decades, was left visibly shaken by the encounter. Watching the incident unfold on a studio monitor from his office, Carson reportedly went pale and seriously considered canceling Sinatra's segment on the spot. Only a reminder from the producers about the massive ratings boost Sinatra would bring convinced Carson to move forward with the taping. From that moment on, Johnny Carson's polite on-screen smile whenever Frank Sinatra appeared wasn't born of admiration. It was pure professionalism, masking a quiet disgust that never faded. The most revealing moment of their strained relationship came during a commercial break several years later. Sinatra made a crude remark about a female staff member's appearance, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. The comment was sexually explicit and demeaning, the kind of casual cruelty powerful men of that era often displayed without consequence. But Carson, breaking his usual calm professionalism, turned to Sinatra and said in a cold, measured tone that cut through the studio chatter, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The air in Studio One went completely still. Sinatra, apparently stunned that anyone, even Johnny Carson, would dare challenge him publicly, sat in silence and stared straight ahead. When the cameras came back on moments later, both men wore their usual television smiles, but everyone behind the scenes could feel the chill radiating between them. Carson's questions became noticeably shorter, his tone more detached and formal. Once the taping ended, he reportedly told his producer directly, "I don't care how good his ratings are. Limit him to once a year maximum." For Carson, who rarely interfered in booking decisions, this directive was extraordinary and spoke volumes about how deeply Sinatra's behavior had offended him. Joan Crawford. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, Audiences saw exactly what they expected: the elegant legend they had adored for decades, sitting with flawless posture in her perfectly tailored suit. With her immaculate style and carefully practiced charm, she embodied old Hollywood glamour in its purest form. But according to several members of the Tonight Show staff who were present that day, the woman behind the camera bore no resemblance whatsoever to the gracious icon she portrayed on screen. Years later, Carson reportedly told his biographer with unusual bluntness, "She was one of the coldest people I've ever interviewed. Talking to her was like talking to a beautiful statue. Nothing inside." That assessment wasn't born of a single awkward moment, but from hours of observing Crawford's behavior before, during, and after the taping, watching how dramatically her demeanor shifted depending on who was in the room. The trouble began even before Crawford arrived at the studio that afternoon. Her team had sent over a 4-page list of lighting and staging demands, so specific and detailed that the show's technical director kept a copy of it for decades as proof that the stories were true. "Everything had to be exact," recalled a former producer who dealt with the requirements firsthand. "The angle of her chair, the height of Johnny's desk, even the temperature of the studio, exactly 67 degrees, not 66, not 68. When Crawford finally arrived 3 hours before taping was scheduled to begin, she brought her own makeup crew despite the show already employing award-winning artists who worked with the biggest stars in entertainment every single night. The message was clear: nobody else's standards were good enough for Joan Crawford. She spent the next 2 hours in her dressing room with her personal team, emerging only when everything had been arranged precisely to her specifications. What truly revealed Crawford's character was the stark contrast in how she treated people based on their perceived importance to her career. She practically curtsied to Johnny, a stagehand remembered decades later, the memory still vivid. But when a young production assistant accidentally walked into her dressing room with a glass of water she'd requested, Crawford exploded in fury. According to several witnesses who heard the tirade through the dressing room door, Crawford erupted with such vicious rage that everyone in the hallway froze in disbelief. She allegedly lashed out at the young assistant, a 20-year-old woman just starting her career in television, calling her a brainless little fool. Then, in a moment that shocked even the most hardened crew members, Crawford sneered that the girl should try working in a brothel where incompetence might actually be useful. The young woman burst into tears and ran out of the room while Crawford furiously demanded that she be fired immediately. Carson's producer refused the demand outright, creating an undercurrent of tension that lingered through the entire taping like smoke that wouldn't clear. The most chilling aspect of Crawford's appearance wasn't just her cruelty toward vulnerable staff members, it was the cold precision with which she switched personas the exact moment the cameras came on. She was like a machine pretending to be a woman, one producer recalled. Every response, every laugh, every supposedly spontaneous moment had been rehearsed to perfection. Nothing felt real. During commercial breaks, Crawford would instantly drop her smile and sit in complete silence with a blank expression on her face, refusing to speak to anyone around her, only to come alive again the instant the red light flashed back on. Johnny Carson, known throughout the industry for his ability to make even the most nervous guests feel at ease, could find no real human connection with her. After the show wrapped and Crawford had left the building, he reportedly turned to Ed McMahon and said with a weary shake of his head, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's memoir Mommy Dearest exposed Joan's alleged systematic abuse of her adopted children, Carson wasn't the least bit surprised. Close friends said he simply nodded when he heard the news and remarked quietly, "I saw who she really was in those few hours. I believe every word." Orson Welles. During the Carson era, Orson Welles appeared on The Tonight Show several times, and each appearance captivated audiences with his commanding presence and booming voice that seemed to fill the entire studio. He told fascinating tales from his legendary career, discussing everything from Citizen Kane to his radio days, and viewers at home hung on every word from one of cinema's acknowledged geniuses. But Carson and his team saw something entirely different. They saw a man so consumed by his own legend that he genuinely seemed to believe the ordinary rules of television production no longer applied to someone of his stature. "Never again," Carson reportedly said after one particularly difficult taping in the mid-1970s, "That guy thinks he's still running Rome." The comment was more than just frustration venting. It reflected Carson's growing realization that Welles viewed The Tonight Show not as a collaborative television program, but as merely another stage for his own performances, with everyone else reduced to supporting players in the Orson Welles show. The problems often started long before Welles ever set foot in Studio One. According to several Tonight Show writers who dealt with him directly, He routinely rejected every single question or topic the team had carefully prepared for his segment. He told us our questions were pedestrian and obvious. One former writer recalled, the sting of that dismissal still evident decades later. He literally crossed them all out and handed back a blank page. That left Carson in the nearly impossible position of having to interview one of cinema's greatest figures with no structure, no guidance, and no idea what direction the conversation might take. The situation was made even worse by Welles's habit of launching into endless meandering monologues that were nearly impossible to edit for time. He would start answering a simple question about his latest project, and somehow end up discussing Shakespeare, politics, and the nature of art for 10 minutes straight. The crew would panic, watching the clock and knowing that other segments were being pushed back with no way to stop him. During one appearance in the mid-1970s, Welles was scheduled for a standard 7-minute segment, alongside 2 other guests who were waiting backstage. What happened next became legendary among Tonight Show staff, as the night Orson Welles hijacked the entire program. He stayed on Carson's couch for nearly 25 minutes, completely ignoring every subtle cue Johnny used to signal that it was time to wrap up and move on. Johnny had a whole system, a director later explained. He'd tap his pencil on the desk, shift in his seat, glance at the producer standing off camera. These were all clear signs the segment was over, and it was time to thank the guest and go to commercial. But Welles saw them all and simply kept talking, his voice rolling on like thunder while Carson's smile grew increasingly strained. The result was devastating for the show's carefully planned schedule. 2 guests who had been scheduled never made it to air that night, sent home without appearing because Welles had consumed all their time. Welles' behavior off-camera proved just as difficult for everyone around him. Staff members recalled that he refused to address production assistants directly, instead speaking about them in the third person as if they weren't standing right beside him. "Tell the girl I need more water," he'd announced to no one in particular. "Ask the boy to fix the light." The deliberate dehumanization bothered Carson deeply, who made a point of knowing crew members' names and treating everyone with basic respect regardless of their position. What frustrated Carson most, according to those who worked closest with him, was Welles's tendency to treat The Tonight Show as if it were his own production that he was directing from the guest chair. He would bring unexpected props without warning anyone in advance, jump from topic to topic with no regard for the planned flow, and even try to direct the cameramen from his seat. He actually stood up once and started telling our camera operators which angles to shoot, a former producer remembered with lingering disbelief. Johnny was furious. You could see it in his eyes even though he kept smiling. After that appearance ended, Carson turned to Ed McMahon and muttered words that would become his final verdict on Orson Welles. "Genius doesn't excuse everything. Being brilliant doesn't give you the right to hijack someone else's show." As a man who prided himself on precision and respect for the craft of television, Carson found Welles's complete disregard for structure and other people's time especially infuriating. Publicly, he continued to praise Welles as one of cinema's great visionaries. Privately, however, he began to see him as a cautionary tale, living proof that unchecked ego could overshadow even the most extraordinary talent. Bette Davis. When Bette Davis appeared on The Tonight Show during the 1970s, audiences saw exactly what they had come to adore over decades of legendary performances: a sharp, magnetic presence who was poised, witty, and brimming with stories from her remarkable career in film. But what viewers sitting at home never witnessed were the moments before and after the cameras rolled, when Davis's legendary temper and cutting tongue turned the studio atmosphere ice cold. "She doesn't need a stage," Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon after one particularly tense appearance. "She needs a courtroom. No one should have to be cross-examined by Bette Davis without a lawyer present." According to multiple Tonight Show staff accounts, her first offense came in the dismissive way she treated other guests who appeared on the same episode. When Davis was booked on multi-guest shows, which were common during that era, chaos often followed her entrance like storm clouds rolling in. Davis had developed a habit of interrupting other celebrities mid-sentence, especially younger performers or female guests she apparently viewed as competition for the audience's attention. She would sometimes even turn her back to them on the couch, a deliberate snub that was visible to everyone in the studio and occasionally caught by the cameras. If someone else got a big laugh, a former talent coordinator recalled, you could practically see her fuming, already plotting in real time how to take the spotlight back. The competitive drive that had made her such a powerful screen presence had curdled into something petty and mean-spirited in her later years. Off-camera, Davis's behavior became even harder for the staff to manage. She was known to request whiskey in her dressing room before going on stage, which wasn't particularly unusual for performers of her generation who had come of age in a different era of show business. But her drinking often led to sharp, inappropriate remarks that crossed lines even by the more permissive standards of 1970s television. Several women who worked on The Tonight Show during that period later recalled that Davis occasionally used sexist and racist language so harsh that it shocked even crew members who had heard plenty over the years. "Find someone whose hands don't shake like they've just come off a 3-day drunk." The comment was cruel, baseless, and designed purely to humiliate a woman who was simply trying to do her job. Incidents like these created an atmosphere of dread whenever Davis was scheduled to appear, with staff members hoping they wouldn't be assigned to work with her. The breaking point came when Davis began publicly berating a cue card operator during rehearsal for being too slow with the prompts. Her voice grew louder and more vicious as she berated the man in front of the entire crew, her legendary intensity now directed at destroying someone who made a simple, easily corrected mistake. Carson, who usually avoided direct conflict with guests and preferred to handle problems through his producers, finally stepped in personally. "Johnny actually intervened," said a production assistant who witnessed the confrontation. "He walked over calmly and quietly said, 'Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all.'" Davis froze completely, her mouth still open from whatever she had been about to say. She was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by anyone, let alone another star of Carson's magnitude. Then, without saying another word, she silently backed down and returned to her chair. The rehearsal continued in tense silence. What made Davis so difficult for Carson wasn't just her abrasive attitude toward the people around her. It was the painful contradiction between her undeniable brilliance as an actress and her appalling behavior as a human being. She was without question one of Hollywood's greatest talents, and Carson admired her body of work deeply and had said so many times on air. But after her final appearance in the early 1980s, he reportedly told his producer with finality, "That's it. Life's too short to be verbally flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she's got on her mantle." Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters should have been the perfect Tonight Show guest. A 2-time Academy Award winner with a career that spanned from glamorous ingenue roles in the 1940s to gritty character-driven performances in the 1970s, she was experienced, articulate, and filled with decades of Hollywood history. But according to those who worked behind the scenes, she was also one of the most volatile and genuinely unpredictable guests Carson ever faced during his 3 decades as host. "Shelley doesn't talk, she detonates," Carson reportedly said after one particularly intense interview that left him visibly exhausted. To the Tonight Show crew, Winters became infamous for her complete inability, or perhaps her deliberate unwillingness, to adapt to the show's traditionally lighthearted tone. Instead of sharing funny anecdotes or engaging in the gentle promotional chatter that most guests offered, she often launched into impassioned political speeches or startling personal confessions that left Carson scrambling to keep the segment remotely on track. During one appearance in the mid-1970s, Carson asked a simple, straightforward question about her latest film role. What followed became legendary among the production staff. Winters' answer somehow spiraled into a 5-minute monologue about government corruption, media hypocrisy, and the moral decay of American institutions. "Johnny was a master of conversation control," recalled a former director who had worked hundreds of Tonight Show episodes. "He could steer any interview back on course. But with Shelley, it was like trying to steer a tornado. Once she started, all you could do was hang on tight and hope she stopped before the next commercial break." Her unpredictability extended far beyond her passionate words. Winters had a well-earned reputation for sudden physical outbursts when she felt provoked or disrespected. One particularly famous example came from a British talk show appearance where she threw a glass of whiskey directly in actor Oliver Reed's face after he made sexist remarks about women in the film industry. That story circulated quickly through television circles on both sides of the Atlantic and made the Tonight Show staff extra cautious and nervous whenever she was scheduled to appear. "We actually removed anything breakable from the set before she came on," one stage manager admitted years later, laughing at the memory, but acknowledging it had been a genuine precaution. If it could be thrown, it disappeared. Coffee mugs, ashtrays, anything with weight to it got cleared away during setup. The fact that a major network television show felt compelled to childproof the set for a respected Academy Award winner spoke volumes about Winters' reputation for explosive behavior. Despite all the tension she caused and the headaches she created for producers trying to maintain schedule and tone, many of Carson's colleagues insisted that Winters' volatility came not from cruelty or arrogance like some other difficult guests, but from fierce sincerity. She was passionate about her politics, her beliefs, and her sense of justice, and she genuinely saw every platform, including late-night entertainment television, as an opportunity to say something meaningful, even if it made viewers and hosts uncomfortable. Carson, though visibly uneasy during her more heated moments, respected that authenticity even when it disrupted his carefully crafted show. After one particularly fiery appearance in which Winters launched into an impassioned criticism of the Vietnam War that went on for several minutes, he reportedly turned to his producer backstage and said with a tired smile, "I might not want to spend a weekend with her at a quiet cabin, but I'll give her this much: she believes every single word she says, and that's more than you can say for most people in this town." Shelley Winters might have tested Johnny Carson's patience and legendary composure more than almost any other guest, but she also reminded him and everyone watching that even in the carefully polished world of entertainment television, some guests absolutely refused to play by the established rules. Whether that made her admirable or insufferable depended entirely on which side of the camera you were standing on. Jane Russell, known throughout the 1940s and 1950s for her sultry screen presence in films like The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Jane Russell was one of the defining sex symbols of Hollywood's golden age. Her glamour, quick wit, and status as a genuine Hollywood legend made her an obvious choice for The Tonight Show during the early 1970s. But after only a few appearances, she virtually vanished from Carson's guest list. Insiders say it wasn't a coincidence or a scheduling conflict. It was a deliberate decision that revealed one of Johnny Carson's strongest personal convictions. According to former Tonight Show staff members, Carson became increasingly uncomfortable with Russell's outspoken political views, which he felt crossed the line from legitimate opinion into open intolerance and cruelty. Though Carson himself leaned Republican for much of his life and rarely discussed politics on air, he was extremely careful to keep the show politically neutral and genuinely inclusive of all people. Johnny didn't mind guests with different perspectives, one longtime producer explained. What he couldn't stand was when those opinions turned into cruelty or prejudice directed at real people. Multiple staff members recalled disturbing incidents where Russell would make harsh, disparaging comments about LGBTQ individuals working on the show. During one early 1970s taping, she allegedly refused to let a gay makeup artist do her touch-ups, demanding someone else be brought in instead. The request was phrased as a preference, but everyone understood what it really represented. The makeup artist, a consummate professional who had worked with dozens of major stars, was humiliated by the public rejection. Even more troubling, according to a talent coordinator who worked on the show during that period, was an incident involving actor Rock Hudson. Russell reportedly refused to appear on the same episode as him, making insulting remarks about his sexuality. Though Hudson's homosexuality wasn't publicly known at the time, it was an open secret within Hollywood circles where everyone who mattered already knew. Carson, who counted several gay friends and staff members among his close circle, was deeply offended by Russell's bigotry. He was ahead of his time in that respect, the coordinator said. He just wouldn't tolerate discrimination, not in his studio, not against his people. The final straw reportedly came in 1973 during a commercial break. Russell, apparently feeling comfortable speaking freely while cameras were off, made dismissive remarks about recent civil rights legislation that had been passed to protect minorities. Her comments were overheard by several crew members standing nearby and were quickly relayed to Carson by staff who were shocked by what they'd heard. Though her statements were never captured on tape and therefore never became public, they sealed her fate at Studio One in Burbank. From that point on, Jane Russell was quietly but permanently removed from the Tonight Show roster. No announcement was made, no explanation was offered publicly. She simply stopped being invited, and the booking department had clear instructions that were never written down but were thoroughly understood. For a host who rarely interfered in guest bookings, especially with someone of Russell's enormous stature and fame, the decision spoke volumes about Carson's personal values. It was one of the few times Johnny Carson drew a hard personal line that had nothing to do with ratings, nothing to do with entertainment value, but everything to do with basic principle. He was willing to sacrifice a guaranteed audience draw because he refused to provide a platform to someone whose views he found morally repugnant, particularly when those views targeted vulnerable people who worked for him. Jerry Lewis. Johnny Carson had faced every conceivable type of difficult guest during his 3 decades hosting The Tonight Show. He'd dealt with temperamental legends, self-absorbed stars, unpredictable personalities, and demanding divas. But his strongest, most visceral dislike was reserved for one man whose public image as a comic genius and humanitarian masked what Carson saw as genuine cruelty: Jerry Lewis. To millions of Americans, Lewis was a beloved entertainer who had brought laughter to multiple generations and raised millions of dollars for charity through his annual Labor Day telethons for muscular dystrophy. Yet behind the scenes, according to multiple Tonight Show insiders, Lewis was one of the most demeaning and arrogant celebrities ever to appear on the program. "He's what happens when ego outruns talent," Carson reportedly told a colleague after a particularly unpleasant encounter. That assessment was harsh coming from Carson, who rarely spoke ill of fellow performers, but those who witnessed Lewis's behavior understood exactly what he meant. During one infamous taping that became legendary among staff, Lewis repeatedly interrupted both Carson and the other guests who were trying to participate in the conversation. He dominated every topic, talked over everyone's punchlines, and seemed genuinely unable to share the spotlight for even a moment. At one point, he reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without asking permission, straightening it as if Carson were a child who didn't know how to dress himself. The gesture visibly irritated the usually composed host, whose smile became noticeably frozen for several seconds afterward. His behavior toward the staff proved even worse than his treatment of Carson. Lewis refused to learn anyone's name, instead addressing crew members exclusively by their job titles. "Camera guy, move left," he'd snap. "Makeup girl, fix this." The deliberate dehumanization was particularly galling given his public image as someone who cared deeply about people, especially children with disabilities. "He'd call you sound man even after you'd worked with him 3 times, one crew member recalled with lingering bitterness. "You weren't a person to him, you were just a function." One incident became especially notorious among Tonight Show veterans. During a rehearsal, Lewis suddenly exploded at a camera operator for breathing too loudly. The accusation was absurd on its face. Camera operators wear headsets and stand several feet away, and their breathing would be completely inaudible to anyone on stage. But Lewis erupted anyway, his face turning red as he berated the man for being unprofessional and distracting. The camera operator, a 20-year veteran who had worked with everyone from Bob Hope to Frank Sinatra, stood there in shock while Lewis dressed him down in front of the entire crew. What disgusted Carson most profoundly was the stark contrast between Lewis's carefully crafted public image as a champion for children and his private treatment of people who couldn't advance his career or stroke his ego. That two-faced act made Johnny's skin crawl, a producer recalled. He'd watched Jerry play the humanitarian on camera and then turn around and treat a production assistant like dirt. The hypocrisy was too much for him. After Lewis's final appearance in the early 1980s, Carson reportedly said simply, "Never again," and effectively banned him from the show for the remaining years of his tenure. The ban was never publicly announced or officially documented, but the message reached everyone who needed to know it. Jerry Lewis's name was removed from consideration for future bookings, and he never sat on that couch again during Carson's reign. Years later, after retiring from The Tonight Show, Carson summarized his feelings about Jerry Lewis with rare bluntness during a private conversation that was later shared by a close friend. "In a town full of phonies," he said, "Jerry Lewis stands out as truly hateful, and that takes some doing." Coming from a man who had interviewed thousands of celebrities and maintained professional relationships even with people he personally disliked, that statement represented Carson's ultimate verdict on one of comedy's biggest names. Johnny Carson's private blacklist, which included legendary names like Frank Sinatra, Joan Crawford, Orson Welles, Bette Davis, Shelley Winters, Jane Russell, and Jerry Lewis, offers a revealing glimpse beneath the glamorous surface of Hollywood's golden age. For 3 decades, virtually every major celebrity in entertainment passed through Carson's Studio One in Burbank, giving him a uniquely comprehensive view of who was genuine and who was merely playing a part for the cameras. He wasn't motivated by gossip or personal grudges. He simply couldn't tolerate cruelty, especially when it was directed at people with less power who couldn't fight back. As one longtime director explained, Johnny had a simple test. How did they treat the pages, the assistants, the camera guys? That told him everything he needed to know about who they really were. In the years after Carson's death in 2005, many of his private judgments were proven remarkably accurate, as reports of abuse, arrogance, and serious misconduct by several of these stars became public knowledge and confirmed what he'd observed decades earlier. Representatives for Carson's estate declined to comment on these accounts, and most of the guests mentioned have since passed away. But multiple Tonight Show staff members who worked during the Carson era have confirmed these stories in interviews with entertainment publications including The Hollywood Reporter and Variety. Carson's unspoken blacklist serves as a powerful reminder that behind the smiles and bright lights of Hollywood's golden age were real people, some genuinely inspiring and others deeply, troublingly flawed. As Carson himself once observed during a rare candid moment, the camera doesn't just add 10 pounds, it adds a layer of fiction. His greatest gift to American culture wasn't just making the nation laugh each weeknight for 30 years. It was his ability to see through that carefully constructed fiction to the uncomfortable truth underneath, and his willingness to draw personal lines that others in the industry wouldn't dare cross. What other beloved icons from Hollywood's golden age would Johnny Carson have included on his list if he'd lived long enough to share more stories? The answer to that question died with him, leaving us to wonder what other secrets about our favorite stars he took to his grave.